Okay, so let's really dig into this. Picture it. Dulles International Airport. Just recently, May 2025. A plane touches down, a small group of South Africans gets off,
Yeah.
but maybe not who you'd first picture arriving as refugees in the U.S.
Right. These were white individuals speaking Afrikaners, and their arrival, it wasn't low-key. It felt very, very orchestrated.
Yeah, it was presented by the Trump administration at the time, not just as immigration, but more like a rescue, a
Yeah.
specific lifeline for people they called ethnic minority Afrikaners.
The narrative was that these individuals were fleeing really severe persecution back home in South Africa.
And giving this kind of special entry, essentially refugee status, to only 59 people. I mean, it wasn't just a quiet decision filed away somewhere. It blew up.
Hmm.
Huge global reaction, accusations flying back and forth.
Absolutely. It felt much less like a quiet humanitarian gesture, and frankly, a lot more like a very loud political statement.
The noise around it was deafening, wasn't it? Especially that word genocide. It seemed to just dominate everything and kind of obscured what was actually happening in South Africa and maybe what this U.S. policy was really about.
Exactly. So that's our goal for this deep dive, right? We've had a chance to look closely at the situation in South Africa, examine this specific U.S. policy, and crucially, try to sift the facts from the hype, especially that incredibly loaded genocide claim.
Yeah, we want to get behind those headlines and understand the bigger forces at play here.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how quickly a certain story, a certain narrative can take root, especially when it's about a place with a history as fraught as South Africa's.
For sure. So maybe let's just set the scene a little. South Africa today. I mean, we're talking decades after apartheid officially ended in '94. That system of, brutal racial segregation run by the white Afrikaner minority.
A truly beautiful country, but one that's still, deeply wrestling with the scars of that past. It's not ancient history, it's lived reality.
And those scars show up as massive challenges today. You've got persistently high crime rates affecting everyone, economic struggles, and these ongoing, often really difficult attempts to address the injustices of apartheid.
Right, and that includes specific government policies designed to tackle that history head-on. Things like land reform, affirmative action.
The basic idea being to create a fairer society after decades where the black majority was systematically shut out and oppressed.
Exactly, trying to level that playing field. But, and this is key, these policies, while aiming for redress, have definitely caused friction. There's real tension, and for some white South Africans, a feeling of resentment, maybe even being disadvantaged now.
Which brings us right to the heart of this story, that genocide claim. Donald Trump, back in 2025, talking about government-sponsored race-based discrimination against Afrikaners, and even using the word genocide, often linking it directly to violence against white farmers.
Okay, let's be clear. South Africa does have a terrifyingly high crime rate. That's undeniable, a tragedy for everyone living there, regardless of race. The numbers are stark. Q4 2024, police reported almost 7,000 murders nationwide.
7,000 in 3 months. That's
It
staggering.
really is. And farm attacks, they are absolutely real. They're brutal, horrific events. The data we looked at acknowledges this 12 murders recorded in the farming community in that same quarter, Q4 2024.
12 murders are horrific, but it's a different scale than 7,000 nationwide.
Right.
And it doesn't immediately scream genocide.
Exactly. And this is where the closer look really challenges that narrative. These attacks, they're not exclusively targeting white farmers. Black smallholder farmers, people on non-commercial plots, they are victims too.
And the motives. The research seems pretty clear on this.
Overwhelmingly financial. It's about robbery, getting cash, valuables, not some coordinated campaign of racial extermination.
You mentioned research by Professor Rudolf Zinn.
Yes, from the University of Limpopo. He interviewed convicted farm attackers in prison. And they admitted quite openly to using racial slurs during attacks.
Really? What do they say?
Things like, "I hate you, you took our land," aimed at white victims. Or using awful terms like coconut for black victims. But crucially, they explained why.
Why?
It wasn't ideology, it was a tactic. To instill maximum fear, to make victims comply faster, hand over the money without resistance. It was about the robbery, the cash grab, not about fulfilling some genocidal plan.
So it's instrumental violence using race as a tool for fear.
Precisely. Now, the South African government, President Ramaphosa, they are adamant. They completely reject any claims of state-sponsored persecution or genocide against Afrikaners.
What's their counter-argument?
Their position is that actually white Afrikaners remain, on average, among the most economically successful and privileged groups in the country. They argue these accusations come from groups fundamentally opposed to the government's efforts to redress apartheid's inequalities.
And those policies, land reform, affirmative action, just to be clear on what they are.
Sure. Land reform allows the government, in certain specific limited cases, to acquire land, sometimes through expropriation for redistribution. The goal is to address the historical theft of land from Black South Africans.
Okay.
And affirmative action gives preferential treatment in hiring and promotions to people from groups previously discriminated against under apartheid, again aiming to correct decades of systemic exclusion.
So you hear wildly different takes on these, right? Some see them as anti-white, others as essential justice.
Absolutely. But based on the information we reviewed, calling the crime situation or these specific policies genocide, it just doesn't align with the facts on the ground. It feels like a massive, massive exaggeration.
Okay, so if it's not genocide, why do some white South Africans feel the need to leave? Why seek refuge under this specific U.S. program? There must be something driving it.
Oh, absolutely. And those reasons are often very personal, very real. We're not dismissing the fear or anxiety people feel.
Like the story of Kyle? The father?
Yeah, a divorced dad with 3 kids. He genuinely felt there was no future for his white children there. He believed affirmative action put them at the bottom of the hiring list, basically locking them out of opportunities. That's his lived experience, his fear for his kids.
And Estee Richter from Orania.
Right. Orania, that sort of self-contained Afrikaner town. Her story is raw fear. Her father-in-law was murdered on his farm back in 2022. For her, and people like her, the desire to leave stems directly from experiencing or fearing that kind of horrific violence.
And that personal fear seems reflected in wider surveys, doesn't it?
It does. That 2022 data point, 62% of white South Africans saying they'd considered emigrating. That's significantly higher than the general population figure, which was around 27%.
So it's the overall high crime rate, which affects everyone.
Definitely. South Africa has one of the highest murder rates globally. That's a universal fear.
But for some white South Africans, that's compounded by this feeling of, what? Cultural loss, economic anxiety, a sense that things are shifting away from them.
I think that's a fair summary. A sense of displacement, perhaps. Even in a place like Orania, trying to create a separate space, people know the broader reality exists. We saw a quote from someone there, a carpenter, saying, basically, you can't hide in Orania forever. South Africa's complexities are right outside.
Still, it's important to keep perspective on the numbers, right? Considering leaving isn't the same as actually packing up and going.
Absolutely. Critical point. 62%, considering it is still a fraction of the nearly 5 million white people in South Africa. It signifies unease, yes, but not necessarily an imminent mass departure.
Which leads us nicely back to the U.S. policy, that executive order from February 2025. It specifically targeted Afrikaners and racial minorities in South Africa who could prove persecution or a credible fear of it.
And the striking thing was the speed. Those 59 people who arrived in May, it was incredibly fast. Like, blink and you miss it fast compared to the years refugees from, say, Syria or Congo might wait.
And the arrival itself was quite the photo op, wasn't it? Kids with little American flags, Deputy Secretary Landau there to greet them.
Very visible, clearly meant to send a message. And this is where the criticism really sharpened. People started calling it selective compassion.
How so?
Well, you contrast this rapid processing of 59 people with, say, the millions displaced by the horrific civil war in Sudan, where deaths were estimated in the hundreds of thousands, or people desperately trying to escape Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover. They wait often for years in terrible conditions.
And then there's the situation closer to home, like at the U.S.-Canada border.
Right. Under the Safe Third Country Agreement, asylum seekers showing up there are often turned away, told they should have claimed asylum in Canada first. So you have people being turned away at one border while another group is seemingly fast-tracked from halfway across the world.
What was the administration's justification for singling out this group?
The official line, voiced by spokesperson Anna Kelly, was that it was about human rights, about protecting persecuted minorities. Purely humanitarian was the claim.
But the irony wasn't lost on observers, was it? Given the history?
Not at all. The very group, Afrikaners, who designed and implemented apartheid, a system built on racial persecution, were now being framed by this U.S. policy as the primary victims needing rescue.
And South Africa's government kept pushing back.
Consistently. Their foreign ministries stated the claims were unfounded, didn't meet the international legal standard for persecution, and they kept pointing to the economic reality. Poverty over 50% for Black South Africans, under 10% for whites. It just didn't fit the profile of a persecuted, destitute minority.
Okay, let's tackle that fear directly then. The avalanche narrative. Is this policy the start of a massive wave of white South Africans coming to the U.S.?
Honestly, based on everything we've seen, the numbers, the practicalities, the context, it seems highly, highly unlikely. The avalanche narrative feels like, well, mostly fear-mongering.
Why so definitive?
Well, first, the numbers themselves. 59 arrived, maybe a few thousand interested, tops. Compare that to the millions displaced globally. It's a trickle, not a flood.
And the logistics.
Exactly. Vetting even a few thousand people properly for refugee status takes time, resources, arranging flights, resettlement infrastructure. It's a huge logistical challenge. You can't just conjure up an avalanche like that.
Plus, there's the human element, right? People don't just uproot their entire lives easily.
No. I mean, most white South Africans aren't exactly desperate to trade the lifestyle, the climate, the culture of Johannesburg or Cape Town for, say, Minnesota in January. Someone joked about missing braai and biltong, maybe facetious, but it points to real cultural connections.
Good point. It's not like white people from other developed countries like Australia or Canada are suddenly rushing to the U.S. either, is it?
Not really. And white South Africans, while facing genuine crime fears, often have resources. Private security, gated communities, global networks. Immigration might be an option for some, but it's usually planned, often to places with existing ties, not necessarily a panicked flight for U.S. refugee status.
So the avalanche talk sounds more like a political tool.
It certainly seems that way. A useful talking point for those who benefit from stirring up racial anxiety, rather than a reflection of reality.
Stepping back then, this whole episode feels like a small story that reveals much bigger themes.
Definitely. It's like a microcosm of how race, history, memory, and politics all collide on the world stage.
You see South Africa itself trying to navigate this incredibly complex path. How do you address the profound injustices of the past through things like land reform without completely alienating segments of your population or damaging the present? It's a tightrope walk.
A really difficult one, and those policies become flashpoints for these larger debates.
And then you see the U.S. policy, under Trump at that time, seemingly playing directly to a domestic audience interested in ideas of reverse racism or white victimhood.
It fits a certain populist strategy, doesn't it? Identify a group perceived as sympathetic by your base, frame them as unfairly treated, amplify their fears, declare you're taking action. It resonates politically, regardless of the nuance.
But justice, especially in a place like South Africa, it's rarely that simple, is it? It's not usually a zero-sum game where helping one group means hurting another.
Not at all. Healing those kinds of deep historical wounds needs nuance, it needs dialogue, it needs incredibly careful policy. Inflammatory rhetoric and sound bites don't really help achieve that.
So in the end, 59 Afrikaners started new lives in the U.S. under this specific policy, but back in South Africa.
Millions upon millions of South Africans, black, white, colored, Indian, everyone are still there, living their lives, dealing with the country's challenges, trying to build its future, day in and day out.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, we really peeled back the layers on that story about the Afrikaner arrivals at Dulles. We looked past the headlines of the claims, the context in South Africa, the personal fears driving some to leave, and the very particular selective nature of that U.S. policy.
Yeah, and the big takeaway seems pretty clear. That narrative of a looming avalanche, a mass exodus fueled by genocide, it just doesn't square with the facts or the numbers we looked at.
It feels much more like political theater, using that desirable refugee angle built on a foundation of, frankly, vastly exaggerated claims. It kind of masks the much messier reality in South Africa. Real crime problems, yes, real fear for some, but also these vital efforts at historical redress and the undeniable existence of ongoing unequal privilege.
The numbers show it was a tiny trickle, definitely not a flood.
And maybe this whole story is a really potent reminder, isn't it? How powerful narratives can be, especially when they tap into race and victimhood. How they can be shaped, sometimes deliberately distorted for political advantage, even when the reality on the ground is far more complex and nuanced.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about which global crises get our attention, which groups of people seeking safety end up in the spotlight, and which remain in the shadows. What really drives who gets help and whose story gets told.
Something important to keep reflecting on for sure.